Korea Mafia boss asks his son to choose a new mother from 3 rich women. He chose the Black Nanny. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight, a heavy curtain of expectation that made the air feel thin. Kang Tae-sung didn't move, yet his presence loomed over his son like a thunderhead. He had always been a man of few words, but today, his silence carried the finality of a gavel. The 3 queens shifted ever so slightly in their leather chairs, the soft rustle of their designer silk sounding like the sharpening of knives in the stillness. They were used to negotiating billions, but they were beginning to realize that the most difficult acquisition in Seoul was the affection of a silent 10-year-old boy. Jaewon's eyes remained fixed on the doorway. He could feel the heat of the candidate's stares. The way Seo Yeren's eyes searched his face for a weakness to exploit, the way Lee Seoyun mentally drafted a schedule to optimize his potential, and the way Dr. Kang Mina observed his posture as if diagnosing a defect. They were waiting for him to step forward, to play his part in this elaborate corporate courtship. But Jaewon was listening for something else. He was listening for the steady, grounding rhythm of Amara's breath from the shadows of the hall. For the elite women, Amara Okoye was part of the architecture, a silent fixture in a gray uniform meant to blend into the marble walls. They had treated her with the casual dismissiveness one might show a piece of furniture, unaware that she was the architect of the only piece Jaewon had known since the accident. While they had spent the last 2 weeks filling the mansion with the clatter of high heels and the sharp scent of expensive perfumes, Amara had moved through the house like a soft breeze. She didn't offer him empty promises of a new family. Instead, she had sat on the floor of his darkened room and told him stories of a distant land where the sun turned the soil to gold. Taesung's voice finally broke the tension, low and resonant. The time for evaluation has passed. He didn't look at the women, he kept his gaze on the back of his son's head, watching the way the boy's shoulders trembled under the weight of the black hanbok. Jaewon, you have seen how these women intend to lead this house. You have seen who offers you a future of power, and who offers you a future of legacy. Now, tell me. Who stays? Seo Yeren leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the late afternoon sun. She wore a smile that she likely thought was motherly, but to Jaewon, it looked like the predatory grin of a fox. She had tried to buy his favor with a limited edition racing drone that sat untouched in its box. Beside her, Seoyun adjusted her glasses, her dark business suit a armor of professionalism. She had presented Jaewon with a curriculum for an elite boarding school in Switzerland, promising him the world. They were offering him things, titles, and trajectories. They were offering him everything his mother's death had proven was temporary. Jaewon took a single, slow step. He didn't move toward the polished mahogany table where the candidates sat. Instead, he turned his back on the glittering Seoul skyline and walked toward the doorway. The room seemed to contract. Yeren's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her immaculate makeup. Mina's pen stopped mid-air over her notepad. As he reached the threshold, Amara's eyes met his. She didn't reach out, she didn't try to pull him toward her. She simply stood her ground with a quiet dignity that made the designer suits in the room look like cheap costumes. In her eyes, Jaewon didn't see a mafia heir or a strategic asset. He saw a reflection of a boy who was allowed to be sad, a boy who was allowed to be small. He reached out, his small, pale hand disappearing into the warmth of her deep brown palm. The contact was a silent explosion in the room. Her, Jaewon said, his voice cracking the silence for the first time in months. It was a whisper, but in the suffocating quiet of the penthouse, it sounded like a revolution. Taesung's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed as he looked past his son to the woman in the gray uniform. He saw the way she held his son's hand, not with the grip of a servant, but with the fierce, protective strength of someone who had already decided he was worth more than the empire he stood to inherit. The queens were frozen, their carefully constructed plans dissolving into a sea of bruised egos and whispered scandals. They had come to win a throne, but they had lost to a woman who had only come to keep a promise. The queens did not leave easily. As the heavy mahogany doors finally clicked shut behind the last of the security detail, the perfume of the three women still hung in the air like a lingering threat. They had retreated to the guest wing, a sprawling labyrinth of white marble and cold light, but their presence felt like an infection in the house's silence. They weren't just here for a marriage certificate, they were here for sanctuary. In the farthest suite, Seo Yerin sat on the edge of a velvet chaise, her hands trembling as she reached for a glass of water. To the tabloids, she was the untouchable jewel of the Seo shipping empire, but here, in the oppressive privacy of the Kong penthouse, the facade was cracking. Her phone buzzed incessantly, a series of untraceable messages from a man who knew exactly where she had been the night her younger brother accidentally disappeared from the family yacht. Taesung's protection was the only thing that could bury that secret deep enough to keep her from a life sentence. She didn't need a husband. She needed a fortress. Across the hall, Lee Seoyeon was already at her laptop, the blue light washing out her sharp features. Her strategic mind was currently calculating the odds of a hostile takeover, not of a company, but of her own life. Her father's gambling debts had spiraled into the billions, owed to creditors who didn't use banks, but bone saws. She had promised them a seat at the Kong family table in exchange for her life. Every second Jaiwon spent holding Amara's hand was a second. Seoyeon's clock ticked closer to midnight. To her, the boy wasn't a child to be loved, he was a human shield. Then there was Dr. Kong Mina. She didn't pace, and she didn't check her phone. She stood by the window, staring out at the Han River, her mind a clinical map of risk and reward. Her secret was the most dangerous of all, hidden behind the humanitarian medical trials she had authorized in the border provinces. The bodies were piling up, and the government was starting to ask questions her prestigious family couldn't silence. She needed Taesung's underworld influence to make the evidence vanish. She had looked at Jaiwon's fragile heart, not with pity, but with a scientist's cold interest in a ticking clock. In the center of this web of desperation stood Kong Taesung. He watched the security feeds from his private study, the screens illuminating the jagged scars on his forearms. Reminders of a life spent in the dirt so his son could walk on clouds. He knew they were desperate. He had chosen them precisely because their secrets made them manageable. A woman with nothing to lose was a liability, a woman with everything to hide was a tool. But Amara was the variable he hadn't calculated for. She was the only one in the house who didn't owe him a debt, the only one whose past didn't smell of blood or greed. As he watched her lead Jaiwon toward the kitchen for a late-night cup of tea, the boy's steps were lighter than they had been in over a year. Taesung felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest. He was a master of leveraging secrets, but he had no idea how to leverage a promise made to a dead woman. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid glowing in the dim light. The game had officially begun. 3 women were fighting for their lives, 1 boy was fighting for his heart, and an invisible nanny was about to find out that in this house, the only thing more dangerous than a secret was the truth. The clock in the grand hallway struck 3 a.m., its chime echoing through the obsidian corridors like a funeral bell. In the master guest wing, the silence was suddenly shattered by a sound that made the very air in the mansion vibrate with primal fear. It was a high, thin wail that escalated into a full-bodied scream, a sound of a child being hunted in his own mind. Kong Jaiwon was no longer a silent heir in a silk hanbok, he was a terrified boy trapped in the wreckage of a memory that had haunted him for 14 months. The 3 queens were the first to reach the door. Seo Yerin burst into the hallway, her silk robe fluttering, her face a mask of annoyance quickly replaced by a staged, wide-eyed concern. Beside her, Lee Seoyeon stood rigid, her fingers subconsciously tapping her thigh as if counting the seconds of this unplanned interruption. Dr. Kong Mina arrived last, her professional instincts warring with her personal detachment. They stood clustered in the doorway of Jaiwon's bedroom, illuminated by the cold, pale moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the boy was thrashing against his designer sheets, his eyes open but seeing nothing but the fire and shattered glass of the night his mother died. He was gasping for air that wouldn't come, his small hands clawing at the emptiness. Jaiwan, stop this immediately. It's just a dream, Yeren called out, her voice sharp and lacking the warmth to penetrate a nightmare. She stayed firmly in the doorway, her feet refusing to touch the plush carpet as if the boy's grief were contagious. He needs a sedative, Mina stated flatly, her eyes scanning the room for a medical kit. This level of cortisol is damaging. If he doesn't calm down, he'll induce a cardiac spike. Seoyin merely checked the time. This will affect his morning schedule. We need to establish a disciplined routine for these outbursts. None of them moved. To them, the screaming child was a puzzle to be solved or a nuisance to be managed. They stood like frozen statues of ambition, their polished exteriors reflecting the moonlight but offering no heat. They were experts in strategy, medicine, and social grace, but they were illiterate in the language of a broken heart. Then, the invisible thread began to pull. Amara appeared behind them, moving through the group like a shadow passing through smoke. She didn't ask for permission, and she didn't offer a diagnosis. She walked straight into the storm, ignoring the clinical observations and the frantic suggestions of the elite women. She sat on the edge of the bed, her presence a sudden, heavy anchor in the room. She didn't try to wake him with logic. Instead, she began to hum. It was a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. Then, the words followed, soft, melodic Igbo syllables that felt like a warm blanket being wrapped around the boy's shivering soul. It was a song of the old world, an ancient warrior's lullaby meant to ward off the spirits of the dark. Her voice didn't fight the scream, it danced around it, pulling the edges of the nightmare apart with a rhythmic, pulsing grace. Nwam, hi nne, a no meba, she whispered, her hands gently pinning Jaiwan's flailing arms to his chest, not with force, but with the steady weight of a protector. The change was instantaneous. Jaiwan's thrashing slowed. The high-pitched gasps transitioned into long, shaky exhales. He leaned into her, his head finding the hollow of her shoulder as if it were the only safe place left in the world. The Igbo lyrics flowed over him like rainfall on parched soil, the language of shifting earth finally silencing the sounds of crashing metal and sirens. In the doorway, the three women watched in a stunned, ugly silence. They saw the boy's fingers lock into the fabric of Amara's gray uniform, his breathing finally synchronizing with hers. They saw the way Amara rocked him, her colorful head wrap a vibrant contrast against the sterile black and white decor of the room. From the shadows of the hallway, further back than any of them had realized, Kang Tae-sung watched. He saw the queens standing frozen, useless in the face of genuine suffering. And he saw the nanny, a woman who owned nothing but a song, doing what all his billions could not. He saw the thread that connected Amara to his son, a thread made of something stronger than blood or gold. It was the first time in 14 months that the house was truly quiet. The morning light in the penthouse was as sharp and clinical as a surgeon's blade, reflecting off the polished marble floors until the entire living area felt like a stage under a spotlight. Seo Yeren had spent the early hours preparing her counteroffensive. If Amara Okoye was the comfort of the dark, Yeren would be the brilliance of the day. She had arranged a massive chess set on the low mahogany table in the sunroom, the pieces hand-carved from rare Italian marble, their white and black surfaces glistening with a cold, aristocratic light. To Yeren, chess was the ultimate litmus test for a future leader. It was a game of hierarchy, of sacrificing pawns to protect the king, and of understanding that every move was a cold calculation. When Jaiwan entered the room, still pale from the night's terrors but moving with a quiet, renewed steadying, Yeren didn't ask how he felt. Instead, she gestured with a perfectly manicured hand toward the board. Jaiwan, sweetie, come sit, she said, her voice a practiced melody of artificial warmth. This is a game for kings. Your father is a man of strategy, and if you are to stand beside him one day, you must learn to think 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I've brought this set specifically for you. It's a game of nobility, of knowing who belongs on which square. Jaiwan stood at the edge of the sunroom, his gaze tracking the heavy marble pieces. He looked at the queen, tall and imposing, and then at the king, isolated and surrounded by walls of stone. It looked less like a game and more like the house he lived in, beautiful, expensive, and utterly rigid. He felt the weight of her expectation, the way she was trying to mold his hands to grip the cold stone. "I don't like it," Jaiwan whispered, his voice small but remarkably firm. Yaren's smile didn't reach her eyes, it merely tightened at the corners. "It's not about liking it, darling. It's about becoming who you were meant to be. A boy of your status doesn't play with toys. He masters the board. Now, sit. Let's start with the opening move." But Jaiwan's attention had already drifted. In his pocket was a small, worn velvet pouch Amara had given him that morning after his tea. He reached inside and pulled out several smooth, dark seeds and a simple piece of wood that had been carved with small, circular indentations. It was a mancala board, or ao, as Amara had called it, hand-carved from a scrap of cedar she had found in the garden. It didn't glisten like marble. It smelled of earth and rain. "Amara showed me this," Jaiwan said, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "She said this game isn't about killing the other king. She said it's about how you distribute what you have. If you're greedy, you lose. If you share correctly, you win." Yaren's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson beneath her immaculate foundation. "That is a game for servants, Jaiwan. It has no structure, no history that matters in our world. You cannot compare a piece of scrap wood to Italian marble." "The marble is cold," Jaiwan replied, finally looking Yaren in the eye with a perception that made her flinch. "And it feels like a cage. Amara's game feels like a conversation." He didn't wait for her permission. He sat on the floor, ignoring the velvet chairs and the marble table, and began to drop the seeds into the wooden pits with a rhythmic click-clack that echoed the heartbeat of the song she had sung to him the night before. From the doorway, Lee Seoyeon and Dr. Mina watched, their expressions a mix of calculation and burgeoning spite. They saw Yaren's failure not as a tragedy, but as a tactical opening. However, they also saw something more troubling: the boy was no longer just a silent observer. He was starting to choose his own weapons. Kang Tae-sung stood in the shadows of the upper mezzanine, his hands gripped tight on the railing. He looked down at the bribe of marble, sitting abandoned on the table, and then at his son, sitting on the floor with a piece of wood, learning a lesson about generosity from a woman the world called a maid. For the first time, Tae-sung began to wonder if he was the one being tested. The rain began to lash against the reinforced glass of the penthouse study, blurring the neon veins of Seoul into a smear of electric blue and terminal red. Kang Tae-sung sat in the center of the gloom, the only light in the room emanating from a decrypted tablet lying on his desk. Across from him, his lead investigator, a man who existed only in the peripheral of the city's ledgers, stood with his head slightly bowed. The air was thick with the ozone of high-end electronics and the heavy, metallic scent of a truth about to be unearthed. On the screen was a file that shouldn't have existed. It was buried under 3 layers of offshore encryption and a ghost protocol from a Lagos-based medical university. The invisible nanny, the woman who had crossed an ocean to wash floors and sing lullabies in a gray uniform, was looking back at him from a professional headshot. But she wasn't Amara the maid. She was Dr. Amara Okoye, a top-tier child psychologist whose research on trauma-induced mutism had been cited in journals from London to Johannesburg. She disappeared from the professional circuit 8 months ago, the investigator whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Sold her practice, liquidated her assets, and took a position as a domestic worker for your late wife's charitable foundation. She used a forged identity to enter your household. Tae-sung's thumb traced the edge of the tablet. He thought of the way she had calmed Jaiwan's night terror with a song that seemed to bypass the brain and speak directly to the blood. He thought of the cedarwood game she had carved, a conversation that had dismantled Seo Yaren's marble trap without firing a single shot. It hadn't been luck. It had been precision. She wasn't just a woman with a kind heart, she was a master of the human mind, operating on his son with the surgical delicacy of a ghost. Why? Taesung asked, the word vibrating with the threat of his underworld authority. A woman of her caliber doesn't scrub floors for a salary that wouldn't buy her a pair of Yaren's shoes. The investigator swiped the screen to a medical ledger. Her younger brother, Chitty. He's in a specialized facility in Abuja. Rare degenerative condition. The experimental treatment he needs is only available through a private pharmaceutical conglomerate, one that happens to be a subsidiary of your own holdings, sir. The cost is astronomical. She isn't here for a career. She's here for the employee medical bypass that only your top-tier domestic staff can access without raising red flags with the board. Taesung leaned back, the shadows of the room swallowing his face. The queens were in this house to save themselves from their own greed and secrets. But Amara was here for a sacrifice. She had traded her brilliance, her status, and her very identity to honor a promise to a dying friend and to keep her own blood breathing. She was the most dangerous person in the penthouse because she was the only one who didn't fear him. She only feared failing the people she loved. The investigator waited for the order to remove her, to expose the fraud. But Taesung remained silent. He looked at the security feed on a secondary monitor. Amara was in the kitchen, her dark hands folded neatly over her apron as she prepared a simple meal for a boy who was finally starting to believe the world wasn't made of glass. He realized then that the three queens had arrived with designer luggage and expensive ambition, thinking they were the hunters. They never suspected that the invisible woman in the background was the only one in the room with the power to truly dismantle the Kong Empire, or to save the boy who sat at its center. Taesung didn't move to delete the file. Instead, he locked it. In the game of shadows he played, a secret like hers wasn't a reason to cast her out, it was the ultimate leverage. The smell of old parchment and expensive leather usually offered a sense of order, but tonight, the penthouse library felt like a bunker. The queens had retreated into the mahogany-lined sanctuary, the heavy double doors serving as a barricade against the invisible presence that was slowly dismantling their influence. They didn't bother with the staged smiles or the performative grace they exhibited in the sunroom. Here, in the dim glow of the library's recessed lighting, their desperation was naked, and their language was stripped of its designer polish. Seo Yeren paced the length of the Persian rug, her heels digging into the intricate patterns. "She is a weed," Yeren hissed, her voice trembling with the humiliation of the morning's failed chess match. A common domestic worker who thinks she can whisper African superstitions into the ear of the Kong heir. Do you see the way he looks at her? Like she's a savior instead of a servant. She stopped, turning to the others with a look of pure venom. She's poisoning him against the culture he is meant to lead. It's a security risk, if we're being honest. Who knows what she's actually saying to him in that language of hers? Lee Seoyin sat at the heavy oak desk, her tablet open to a logistics spreadsheet that was no longer about profit margins, but about removal. She is a variable that cannot be calculated, Seoyin agreed, her tone clinical yet biting. I've tracked the house accounts. She's taking nothing extra, which makes her impossible to bribe. And Taesung. Taesung is becoming distracted by the boy's improvement. If we don't excise her now, Jaiwon will be completely unmanageable by the time the formal selection begins. We need to frame it as a matter of educational standards. A boy of his standing shouldn't be playing with seeds and wood. He should be with tutors who understand the global market, not some girl from a continent he'll only ever visit for resource extraction. Dr. Kong Mina poured herself a drink from the crystal decanter, the amber liquid sloshing against the glass. It's more than just education, Seoyin, she muttered, her eyes dark. It's hygiene. Psychological hygiene. She's encouraging his trauma by letting him wallow in those night terrors. He needs clinical intervention, not folk songs. She is an uneducated interloper playing at being a mother, and it's dangerous. If Jaiwon has another episode and she's the only one he calls for, our positions become entirely redundant. We have to show Tae-sung that her kindness is actually a form of grooming. The three women leaned in closer, their silhouettes merging against the rows of leather-bound books. They began to draft the narrative. A series of lost heirlooms planted in Amara's room, a whispered report to the board about inappropriate cultural influence, and a coordinated insistence that Jaewon's recent stability was a temporary fluke caused by a lack of proper discipline. They spoke of Amara as if she were a plague, their words dripping with a prejudice that saw her gray uniform not as a badge of service, but as a mark of inherent inferiority. By tomorrow evening, Yeren whispered, a cruel triumph lighting her eyes, she'll be back on a plane, and the boy will realize that marble is the only thing that lasts. They were so consumed by their own conspiracy that they didn't notice the faint, rhythmic pulse of a blue light beneath the lip of the mahogany bookshelf. High above them, in the silence of his private study, Kang Tae-sung sat with his back to the window, his jaw set in a line of hard iron. The library's high-fidelity microphones captured every syllable, the weeds, the hygiene, the resource extraction. Tae-sung watched the trio on his screen, their faces distorted by the very greed they tried to hide. He thought of the file he had locked only an hour ago, the file of Dr. Amara Okoye, the world-class psychologist who had sacrificed everything for a brother's life. He looked at the queens, and saw three women who were hollow, their souls as cold as the marble they championed. They thought they were the architects of Amara's downfall, unaware that every prejudiced word they uttered was being etched into a digital record that would serve as their own death warrants. Tae-sung didn't stop the recording. He simply turned up the volume, listening to the sound of his future wife candidates destroying themselves in the dark. The formal dining room was a cathedral of glass and shadow, where the weight of expectations felt heavier than the crystal chandeliers overhead. Kang Tae-sung sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, a silent titan presiding over a theater of war. The three queens were arrayed like colorful, predatory birds, their silks rustling as they picked at a dinner of delicate hanjeongseok that remained largely untouched. Amara stood in the periphery, a silent sentinel in her gray uniform, moving with a rhythmic efficiency that seemed to irritate the women more than any open defiance could. The air was thick with a manufactured civility that finally curdled during the second course. Seo Yeren, frustrated by the invisible barrier Amara had built around the boy, turned her attention toward the nanny with a sharp, performative curiosity. Amara, dear, Yeren began, her voice carrying that high, artificial lilt that always preceded a strike. I was trying to explain the summer itinerary to Jaewon, but he seems so distracted by those stories you tell him. Tell me, back in. Where was it? Your village. Do people actually believe those fables, or is it just a way to pass the time when there's no electricity? A ripple of cruel amusement passed between Seoyin and Mina. Amara paused, her hands steady as she held a porcelain tureen. They are not just stories, Ms. Seo, she replied, her voice low and resonant, the rich, melodic cadence of her Igbo-influenced English filling the room. They are oral histories. They teach us that a person's worth is measured by their resilience, not their possessions. Mina let out a short, clipped laugh, dabbing her lips with a silk napkin. Resilience. Is that what you call it? It sounds more like a justification for a lack of progress. And that accent, it's so incredibly thick. Jaewon, darling, you must be careful. If you spend too much time listening to such broken phrasing, you'll forget how to speak the language of the world. It's quite difficult to lead a conglomerate when you sound like a folk tale. Seoyin leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. It's a matter of phonetics, really. It's hard to take a philosophy seriously when it's delivered in such colorful tones. Don't you agree, Tae-sung? A child of his standing needs clarity, not a dialect that belongs in a textbook on anthropology. The mockery was blunt, a coordinated attempt to strip Amara of her dignity before the man they all sought to claim. They laughed softly, a synchronized sound that felt like the sharpening of knives. Amara remained still, her gaze fixed on a point just above the horizon of the table, her face a mask of iron-willed patience. She had endured much worse to save Chitty. She could endure the shallow stings of 3 women who lived in glass houses. But the air in the room suddenly shifted. Jaiwan, who had sat in a catatonic silence for months, the boy who had communicated only through tremors and tearless stares, slowly laid his silver chopsticks down. The clatter against the porcelain was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He looked up, his dark eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been seen since the night the world broke. "Her voice is not broken," Jaiwan said. The silence that followed was absolute. The laughter died in the women's throats, their mouths hanging open in various states of shock. Even Taesung's grip on his wine glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. It was the first time his son had spoken a full sentence in over a year. "Her voice is the only one that doesn't sound like a lie," Jaiwan continued, his voice shaking but growing stronger with every word. He looked directly at Yeren, then at Mina. "She speaks the truth. You just speak in marble." He stood up, his small chair scraping harshly against the floor. He didn't look at his father for permission. Instead, he walked over to Amara and took her hand, his small fingers locking into hers with a fierce, possessive loyalty. "Come on, Amara," he whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I want to hear the story about the lion and the turtle again. The one where the quiet one wins." As they walked out of the dining room together, leaving the queens sitting in the wreckage of their own prejudice, Taesung stayed seated. He didn't stop them. He watched the back of the woman who had done the impossible. He realized then that the library recordings were only half the story. Amara Okoye wasn't just a psychologist or a maid, she was a catalyst. And the fire she had just lit in his son was going to burn the entire house down. The silence in the grand atrium was not a peaceful one, it was a pressurized vacuum, held together by the collective breath of the Kong household. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but tonight, the sprawling lights of Seoul seemed insignificant compared to the drama unfolding within these glass walls. It was the moment of the final verdict, the culmination of months of calculated poise, psychological warfare, and the desperate pursuit of a throne. The 3 queens stood in a perfect, diagonal line across the polished floor, a living triptych of ambition. Seo Yeren was a vision in midnight silk, her posture so rigid it seemed she might shatter if the air grew any colder. Beside her, Lee Seoyin wore a tailored suit of ivory wool, her eyes fixed forward with the unwavering focus of a grandmaster. Dr. Kong Mina stood at the end, her expression a mask of clinical confidence, her hands folded neatly in front of her. They were in their finery, resplendent and smelling of perfumes that cost more than a year of a common man's labor. They each wore the look of a victor, certain that the invisible threat of the nanny had been neutralized by the weight of their status and the logic of their lineages. Across from them, standing slightly apart from the architectural coldness of the room, was Amara. She was still in her gray uniform, the fabric worn but clean, her only adornment the quiet dignity that had become her shield. She didn't look like a candidate, she looked like a survivor. In the low light of the atrium, her presence felt more solid than the marble pillars surrounding her. She wasn't looking at the women who had mocked her, nor was she looking at the man who held her future in his hands. Her eyes were lowered, her thoughts likely miles away with a brother who fought a different kind of war. Kong Taesung stood at the center of the room, a shadow among the light. In his hand, he held a thin, black tablet, the digital ledger of every secret, every insult, and every sacrifice that had occurred within his home. He looked at the 3 women in their designer armor. He saw the weeds, and the hygiene, and the resource extraction that lived behind their smiles. He saw the hollowness of their victory. The selection process for the future matriarch of the Kong family was never about finding a wife, Taesung's voice cut through the stillness, cold and resonant. It was about finding a mother for my son. It was about finding the one person who could walk into a room of glass and not be afraid to break it. He stepped forward, the sound of his shoes echoing like a heartbeat against the stone. He passed Seo Yeren, whose smile flickered with a sudden, sharp uncertainty. He passed Seoyin and Mina, their confidence beginning to bleed into a confused, silent panic. He stopped in front of Amara. The room seemed to tilt. The queens watched in a paralyzed horror as the man they had spent months courting reached out. He didn't offer a contract or a ring. Instead, he simply tapped the screen of the tablet, displaying a document with a Lagos medical seal. It was the approval for the experimental treatment for Chidi Okoye, fully funded and signed in his own hand. A woman who would trade her name and her pride to save a life is the only one I trust to guard the life of my son, Taesung said, his voice dropping to a level intended only for her. Amara looked up then, her eyes shimmering with a shock that transcended the politics of the house. In that moment, the hierarchy of the penthouse collapsed. The finery of the candidates became nothing more than colorful rags against the stark, simple truth of the woman in gray. The final verdict wasn't a crowning of a queen, it was the recognition of a soul. As Jaiwon stepped out from the shadows to take Amara's hand, the three candidates realized that the game hadn't just ended, it had been fundamentally rewritten. The heavy double doors of the grand atrium stood open like the jaws of a silent beast, revealing a gauntlet of flashes and the low hum of high-end camera shutters. Kang Taesung had turned the final selection into a public spectacle, a broadcast intended to signal the stability of the Kang dynasty to the shareholders and the streets alike. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the electronics and the cloying, floral perfumes of the three candidates who remained anchored to the center of the room. They stood in their designer armor, their faces perfectly composed for the lenses, each believing that the final walk of the air would end at their feet. Seo Yerin adjusted her midnight silk shawl, her eyes fixed on the small boy standing at the far end of the marble floor. To the cameras, she looked like a supportive matriarch. In her mind, she was already redecorating the master wing. Lee Seoyin stood with her chin tilted at a precise angle, her brain calculating the immediate market surge following the announcement. Dr. Kang Mina kept her gaze clinical, her mind already drafting the press release about the rehabilitation of the Silent Prince. They were the apex of Seoul's hierarchy, and they were ready to claim their prize. But Jaiwon didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the reporters or the shimmering lights of the city. He looked at the floor, his small feet in their traditional black slippers moving with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Every step he took echoed through the pressurized silence of the atrium. The three queens leaned in instinctively, their bodies swaying toward him like flowers toward a cold, artificial sun. He passed Seo Yerin first. She reached out a hand, a subtle, graceful gesture meant to guide him to her side, but Jaiwon didn't even flinch. He walked past her as if she were made of the same cold marble as the pillars. The cameras caught the exact microsecond her smile faltered, a jagged crack in the diamond-hard facade. He passed Seoyin next, ignoring the strategic hand she placed on the back of a nearby chair, and then Mina, whose professional detachment finally dissolved into a visible, trembling confusion. The walk of truth was not a path toward power, it was a path away from it. Jaiwon reached the threshold of the room, the place where the shadows gathered and the invisible staff stood in a line of silent service. He stopped in front of Amara. The flashes from the press line became a frantic, blinding strobe, the photographers sensing a deviation from the script they had been sold. Amara remained still, her head wrap a crown of vibrant color against the gray of her uniform. She didn't look at the cameras. She only looked at the boy. With a slow, certain motion, Jaiwon reached out. His small, pale hand, the hand that carried the weight of the Kang future, locked firmly into Amara's deep brown palm. He didn't just touch her, he grabbed her with the fierce, desperate strength of a person who had finally found the shore after a year of drowning. "I'm ready to go now," Jaiwon said. His voice, amplified by the high-fidelity microphone scattered around the room, carried a weight that silenced the room. The cameras captured it all, the billionaire heir rejecting the elite of Korea to stand beside a woman the world saw as a ghost. It was a public execution of the social order. The queens stood frozen in the center of the atrium, their finery suddenly looking like costumes from a play that had been cancelled mid-performance. They were the ones who were now invisible, while the woman in the gray uniform and the boy in the black hanbok became the only two people in the building who mattered. Taesung stepped into the light behind them, his gaze not on the press, but on the joined hands of his son and the woman he now knew to be a doctor of the soul. He saw the walk of truth for what it was, a boy choosing love over a legacy of lies. He raised a hand, and the cameras went dark, the broadcast cut at the precise moment of the world's greatest shock. The public had seen the choice, now, the private justice of the Kong family would begin. The broadcast cameras had been silenced, leaving the atrium in a state of ringing, unnatural quiet that felt heavier than the noise of 1,000 shutters. Kong Taesung stood as the lone architect of the wreckage, his shadow stretching long over the marble floor toward the three women who were now nothing more than ghosts of their own ambitions. He didn't look at his son or Amara yet, he kept his eyes on the queens, his gaze as cold and unyielding as the winter sky over the Han River. "You came into this house thinking you were the players," Taesung began, his voice dropping into a register that made Seo Yerin visibly flinch. "You thought I was the prize and my son was the obstacle. But this house is built on a foundation of truth, and you three have spent every waking hour since your arrival trying to erode it." He didn't need to shout to exert his dominance. He simply gestured to the wall of screens behind him, which flickered to life, showing the high-fidelity recordings from the library. The three queens watched in a paralyzed horror as their own voices filled the room, dripping with the prejudice and malice they had whispered in the dark. They heard themselves call Amara a weed, a hygiene risk, and an uneducated interloper. They heard their coordinated plan to frame her for theft and to use Jaiwon's trauma as a weapon for her removal. "Seo Yerin," Taesung said, turning to the woman in midnight silk. "Your family's debt to the Kong group has just been called in. You didn't come here for Jaiwon, you came here to hide your father's bankruptcy. Consider your candidacy ended, along with your access to our credit lines." Yerin's face went a sickly shade of gray, her perfect composure dissolving into a mask of pure terror. He didn't wait for her to speak before turning to Seoyeon. "And you, the strategist. Your market calculations included selling insider information about our health holdings to your cousins. My legal team will be meeting you at the elevator." Finally, he looked at Dr. Mina. "As for you, doctor, the medical board has already received the recording of you suggesting a child's neurological stability is a hygiene issue. You will never practice in this country again." The dragon's justice was swift, clinical, and absolute. There were no pleas for mercy, no second chances. Security personnel, moving with the same silent efficiency that had characterized the house for years, stepped out from the shadows. With a single nod from Taesung, the three women were escorted toward the back exits, their designer finery looking like funeral shrouds in the dimming light. They left behind nothing but the faint, fading scent of expensive perfume and the echo of their own hollow words. When the doors finally clicked shut behind them, Taesung turned back to the center of the room. He looked at Amara, who was still holding Jaiwon's hand. She didn't look triumphant. She looked weary, the weight of the night finally beginning to show in the slight slump of her shoulders. "Dr. Okoye," Taesung said, using her true title for the first time in the presence of the entire household. "Your brother's flight arrives in Seoul tomorrow morning. He will be moved to our private wing under the care of the best specialists in the world." He walked toward them, stopping just inches away. He didn't ask her to change her uniform, and he didn't offer her a title of nobility. He knew that after what had happened tonight, the gray fabric she wore carried more authority than any silk robe ever could. "This house has had many queens who were interested in the crown," Taesung said, his voice finally softening with a genuine, grounded warmth. "But it has lacked a heart for far too long. From this moment, you are the head of this household. Not because of a contract, but because you are the only one who saw my son before you saw his inheritance." Jaiwon looked up at Amara, a small, knowing smile finally breaking through the shadows of his face. The dragon had cleared the palace of its pretenders, and for the first time in 14 months, the air in the Kong mansion felt clean. Thank you for watching and listening. watch out for part 2. Kindly subscribe and watch out for more.